"I didn't order anything for you and Mom." Josephine said it, then slid 2 warm, wet towels toward me and my wife, as if that was all we deserved at this table, like we didn't belong to the meal. In front of her, a steak wrapped in 24-karat gold was still steaming. I sat there quietly. No menu, no water, no place in the conversation. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. The money I had signed off on for my son just 1 week earlier, the ink was barely dry, but our worth in their eyes had been erased a long time ago. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're listening to this story right now, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Stories like this only keep being told when someone is willing to listen. Now, let me tell you what happened right after that wet towel was pushed toward us. I didn't say anything right away. At 72, I had learned that silence is sometimes the only way to truly see who a person is. I placed the wet towel on my lap, folded it neatly out of old habit. Then I sat up straight in a chair, pushed tight into the corner of the table. My wife Martha gently adjusted my collar. She didn't look at the gold-covered steak. She looked at me, as if asking, should we stand up and leave? I shook my head very slightly. Josephine's 30th birthday was being held at a restaurant overlooking the Miami Ocean. Warm lights reflected off wine glasses, off diamond watches, off expensive dresses. Everything was arranged to display abundance. Everything, except our place at the table. No menu, no welcome, no one asking if we wanted a drink. Josephine sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her hands holding knife and fork like she was attending a performance. Her mother's side of the family laughed loudly. They talked about an upcoming yacht trip, about a newly purchased penthouse. Now and then, eyes flicked toward us, quick, cold. Then, gone, as if 2 well-dressed elderly people were an unnecessary detail. I heard someone say it loud enough that we couldn't miss it. At that age, they still live so frugally. Someone chuckled. Josephine didn't stop it. She only curled her lips slightly and went back to cutting her gold-covered steak. Theodore sat beside his wife. My son. He kept his head down, staring at his phone. Not once did he look our way. No explanation. No invitation to sit closer. I was used to my son's silence. But that night, it felt heavier than usual. I wondered when a family dinner had started requiring assigned worth. While they talked about Miami real estate prices rising fast, I looked out at the ocean. The waves moved steadily. No noise, no show. I thought about the small rental apartment Martha and I live in, about our mornings, instant coffee, one old newspaper shared between us. Nothing glamorous. But never once had I felt small. Until that night. When a server passed by, I tried to ask for a glass of water, but her eyes slid past us and stopped at Josephine, waiting for a signal. Josephine didn't nod, so the young woman walked on. No apology, no question. Martha placed her hand over mine. Her hand was cold. I knew she was trying to stay calm. For many years, she had been more patient than I was. She believed her children's happiness was worth more than her own dignity. I used to believe that too, until the wet towel was placed in front of me like a final answer. Laughter rose again from the head of the table, this time about people who live their whole lives without knowing how to enjoy them. I didn't need to hear more to know who they meant. In my mind, a very different image appeared. The check for $15,000 I had signed just 1 week earlier. The ink still fresh. I remembered that afternoon clearly. Theodore sat in our kitchen, his voice low, talking about overdue office rent, about how he just needed to get through this phase. I didn't ask many questions. I took out the checkbook, signed my name, the habit of a father who had done the same thing for 15 years. Sitting at that table, I suddenly understood the contradiction. I could fix their problems quietly, but our very presence was treated as a public inconvenience. Josephine raised her glass, clinked it with the others. She didn't turn toward us. She didn't need to. In her world, Martha and I were just background. People meant to stay backstage, never invited onto the stage. I looked at the wet towel again, untouched, pure white, clean, just like how they wanted us to disappear from this dinner without leaving a trace. That night, I didn't eat anything. Not because I wasn't hungry, but because I was trying to swallow something else. A feeling I had avoided for too long, the feeling of being excluded from my own family. And when Josephine laughed loudly, bragging that the steak was worth every penny, I finally understood. This dinner wasn't just her birthday. It was a declaration. From now on, everything had a price, and some people apparently did not. That night, while the party was still going on, Martha and I stood up and left. No one stopped us. No one asked where we were going. The wet towel was still on the table. I didn't take it with me. I felt I didn't need any more reminders. On the way home, Martha sat quietly looking out the window. Miami's light slid across her face like passing streaks that never stayed. I knew she was asking herself something, but she didn't speak. We had been together for more than 40 years. Some questions don't need to be said out loud. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the small kitchen table and opened the old folders I kept in a drawer. Not out of anger, but because I needed to understand where I had gone wrong. 15 years earlier, Theodore had stood in front of me holding a thick business plan. He talked about dreams, about financial freedom, about just needing one chance. Back then, Martha and I were still living in the suburban house we had owned for nearly 30 years. The house with a backyard, with the grapefruit tree Martha planted when she was young. We talked for a long time. Then we made a decision I once believed was the right one. We sold the house. $450,000. Every bit of it was transferred into Theodore's account to start his first company. I remember the day we signed the papers. Martha cried. Not because she loved the house too much, but because she believed that sacrifice would help our son stand on his own. I believed it too. In the early years, Theodore called often. He talked about his first contract, about major clients, about a future that seemed wide open. I listened. I nodded. I stayed out of it. When the company began to turn a profit, Theodore bought a new car. Then, a luxury apartment. Then his first trip to Europe with Josephine, who was his girlfriend at the time. Martha and I moved into a smaller rental apartment. It was fine. We told each other it was only temporary, but temporary lasted much longer than I expected. Whenever trouble came up, Theodore came to me. Sometimes it was legal costs, sometimes an office deposit, sometimes just a few more weeks and everything will be fine. I never said no. I never asked for detailed statements. I thought that was a father's trust. Josephine entered our family during that period. She arrived with parties, expensive things, and perfect photos. She never asked how we were living. She only asked Theodore, "Can we upgrade?" And every time she did, Theodore would fall silent and look at me. Once Martha asked our son, "Do you still need your parents' help?" Theodore smiled and said, "Everything was fine." 1 week later, I received a call from the bank. They asked me to confirm an unsecured loan of $50,000 under my name. I thought it was a mistake. I had never signed anything like that. When I checked, all my personal information was correct. The signature wasn't mine, but my account access had been used. I didn't make a scene. I called Theodore. He said Josephine had handled a bit of paperwork, that it was for image investment, that the money would be returned soon. I stayed silent. Again, that was when I began to understand something clearly. I was no longer a father in their eyes. I was a resource. In the years that followed, their life grew more luxurious. More parties, more trips, more things they didn't truly need. And we slowly got used to not being mentioned. Not because we were poor, but because we no longer fit the image they wanted to present. I used to wonder if I was being too sensitive, if it was just a generational gap. But on Josephine's birthday night, everything became too clear to deny. That wet towel wasn't just an action. It was a final statement. Sitting in the small kitchen that night, I sorted through the papers one by one. Money transfers, guarantees, ownership documents I had never examined closely. I realized something important. Many things were still in my name. Not because I insisted on keeping them, but because Theodore had once said, "We'll deal with that later." It's easier this way. I closed my eyes and took a long breath, not to feed anger, but to keep myself clear-headed. I didn't want to destroy my son. I just wanted to stop being used under the name of family. The next morning, Martha made coffee for me. She looked at me for a long moment, then asked one simple question. "Are you okay?" I nodded. For the first time in many years, I felt I was standing at the edge of a real decision, and I knew what happened at that birthday dinner was not the end. It was only the beginning, the moment I stopped being a shadow behind someone else's shine, and finally faced the truth I had avoided for far too long. 1 week later, Theodore called me. My son's voice was softer than usual, as if it had been rehearsed. He said he wanted to make peace. He wanted to invite Martha and me to a small gathering on a friend's yacht. He said it was a way to close some unnecessary misunderstandings. I listened without interrupting. When he asked if I would come, I said yes. I didn't go for an apology. I went because I needed to see everything in full light. That evening, the Miami marina was brightly lit. Lights reflected off the water, off polished white hulls, off perfectly tailored suits. Martha held my hand as we stepped onto the deck. I could feel the tension in her grip. I squeezed back gently, a quiet reassurance. Josephine stood in the middle of the crowd, laughing easily, as if last week's birthday dinner had never happened. When she saw us, she walked over. She hugged Martha quickly, then turned to me. Her smile stopped at polite. No more. Drinks were poured. Music played. The familiar conversations returned investments, real estate, and opportunities only for those who know how to seize them. Theodore stood beside me and spoke in a low voice. He said he needed me to sign a few documents, just procedural. He said it was a large loan, but safe. He said he only needed my help one more time. I looked straight into my son's eyes. No anger, no accusation. I asked one simple question. Have you read carefully what you're asking me to sign? Theodore froze for a moment. He said the lawyers had prepared everything. I nodded. I told him I needed more time. When everyone gathered near the center of the deck, I asked for the microphone. No one objected. They assumed I was going to make a toast. I stood there looking over familiar and unfamiliar faces, people who had shaken my hand before, people who had thanked me for raising Theodore so well. I spoke slowly, clearly enough for everyone to hear. I said I was glad to be invited. I said I had thought a lot after the recent birthday dinner. I didn't repeat details. I simply said that some people in my family were living beyond their own means. The air on the deck shifted. The music softened. Josephine looked at Theodore. Theodore looked at me. I continued. I spoke about the support I had given over the past 15 years. No emotion, just facts. Clear, calm. I talked about guarantees, transfers, about all the times it was only temporary. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply laid out the truth as it was. There were murmurs. Some people looked down at their phones. Others stared out at the sea as if searching for an exit. When I finished, I reached into my jacket pocket and took out a wet towel, the same one I had kept from the birthday dinner. I wiped my hands slowly out of habit. Then I said the sentence I had prepared in advance. I've paid for the yacht rental tonight, but from this moment on, all automatic financial support from me will stop. I didn't use harsh words. I didn't need to. The silence on the deck spoke for me. Josephine stepped forward, her voice sharper than usual. She said I was embarrassing everyone. I looked at her. Then I looked at Theodore. I said no one is embarrassed when the truth is spoken. Only illusions are broken. I took out my phone. I didn't show it to anyone. I tapped briefly. I canceled several recurring payments. The Audi Josephine drove every day was one of them. I didn't announce it. I didn't need to. Martha stood beside me silent. But I knew she understood. She had been waiting for this moment longer than I realized. Theodore didn't speak for several minutes afterward. He looked at me like I was a stranger. Maybe in his mind I had always been the one who signed, who nodded, who stood quietly behind him. I wasn't in that place anymore. The gathering ended earlier than planned. No one argued. They simply left in small groups, carrying questions they hadn't dared to ask. The yacht returned to the dock in silence. Before we stepped off, Theodore called me back. He asked if I was truly serious. I said yes. I told him I wasn't closing the door on our relationship as father and son. I was only closing the door on being treated as an unconditional financial solution. Josephine stood a short distance away. She didn't look at me. Maybe for the first time, she didn't know how to face me anymore. As Martha and I walked down the dock, the sea breeze brushed past us. I took a long breath, not out of relief, but because I knew that from this point on, nothing would be easy. Still, for the first time in many years, I no longer felt like I was chasing a place that never truly existed. I had stopped, and in that stillness, everything around me finally began to shift. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. I didn't answer right away. Martha and I sat down for breakfast like we always did. Toast, black coffee. No one mentioned the night on the yacht, but we both understood this silence was only the pause before everything came crashing down. The first call I took was from Theodore. His voice was no longer gentle. He said I had ruined everything. He said the people who were supposed to invest had pulled out. He said Josephine couldn't cover several payments that were now due. I listened. Then I asked one question very slowly. Those payments, were they based on whose money? Theodore didn't answer. The call ended in silence. That afternoon, Josephine called. This time, her voice was sharp and rushed. She said I had embarrassed her in front of her friends. She said I had no right to interfere in her marriage. I told her I hadn't interfered. I had stepped back. And that was the last right I still had for myself. In the days that followed, things moved faster than I expected. Payments were frozen. Promises were withdrawn. Some partners asked for clarification on the company's ownership structure. I didn't initiate anything during those days. I only answered when asked. And each time I did, one truth became clearer. The foundation they were standing on was never solid. One morning, Theodore showed up at our apartment. He stood outside for a long time before knocking. When I opened the door, he stepped in and looked around the small space. I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, as if he had just realized we'd been living like this for years. He said plainly that if I didn't fix things, everything would collapse. He said Josephine was putting pressure on him. He said I was the only one who could save the company. I asked him a question I had held inside for many years. "Do you actually know who that company belongs to?" Theodore looked at me. Uncertain, I took out a folder. Documents from the day we sold the house. Temporary agreements that had never been finalized. I pointed to one line. My name was still there. 51%. He sat down. For the first time, I saw him unable to speak. I wasn't happy. I didn't feel satisfied. I just felt tired. Tired of letting things go on this long. I told Theodore I would request a full financial review. Not to punish him, but to close the ambiguity that had existed for far too long. Josephine reacted strongly. Long messages. Blame. Accusations. I didn't respond. I let the lawyer handle it. No raised voices. No accusations. Just numbers. The results came quickly. Unclear expenses. Personal payments labeled as marketing costs. Trips listed as partner meetings. No one called it anything dramatic. Just things that could no longer be ignored. Josephine's family began to distance themselves. Invitations disappeared. Calls grew rare. I realized they weren't turning away because of morality. They were turning away because of risk. One late evening, Theodore called me again. He said he couldn't sleep. He asked if I still saw him as my son. I said yes. I said what I would no longer do was act as a life raft for decisions he didn't want to take responsibility for. At one point he said that if things got worse, he would just put us in some cheap care facility and be done with it. Martha was in the kitchen. She heard it. She didn't say anything. I felt a cold run down my spine. Not from fear, but because I had just heard the distance between parents and child named so clearly. I didn't respond to that statement. I only said, "You're speaking out of panic. When you calm down, we'll talk again." I kept my word. I didn't slam the door shut, but I didn't leave it wide open anymore. In the weeks that followed, Theodore's company was forced to face reality. Some contracts were canceled. Some staff left. There was no chaos, just contraction, like a room that was too big for what it truly held. I signed an agreement to sell the shares to a large corporation. Clear terms. I took back my original capital. No more, no less. I didn't want profit from my son's collapse. I just wanted to end a cycle. The day the papers were signed, I came home early. Martha had prepared a simple dinner. She asked if I regretted it. I thought for a long time. Then I said, no. But I regret not stopping sooner. Outside the window, the city was still bright. Miami didn't change because of our story. But in that small room, I knew something had changed. I was no longer living to patch cracks made by others. And when night fell in the rare quiet, I understood this wasn't a battle to win. It was about restoring a boundary, one I had lost long before the wet towel was placed on the table. After everything was finalized, the constant calls stopped. The noise faded as quickly as it had arrived. Our small apartment returned to its familiar rhythm. Quiet mornings, afternoons with sunlight stretching across the windowsill, evenings with enough time to sit beside each other without needing many words. Theodore called once after the share transfer became public. His voice was lower than before. No blame, no demands. He asked if we could meet. I agreed, not to lecture him, just to close a chapter. We met at a small cafe, no big sign out front. Theodore arrived early. He stood up when he saw me, awkward like a boy again. He apologized. Not long, not pleading. I listened. Then I nodded. I told him I didn't need promises. I only needed him to take responsibility for the choices he made. He stayed quiet for a long time. Then he said he understood. Josephine didn't come with him. I didn't ask. Some distances don't need to be named anymore. In the weeks that followed, Martha and I talked about what we would do next. We didn't think about long trips, not because we couldn't afford them, but because we wanted to stay where we belonged. The old town where we once lived, where streets don't need flashy lights, where people still greet each other by name. We decided to use what remained of the money to start a small scholarship fund. Martha suggested the name Gratitude. I agreed immediately. Not to remind anyone to be thankful to us, but to remind ourselves that help only has meaning when it doesn't turn the giver into a tool. On the first day we announced the fund, there were no cameras, no long speeches, just a few students, a few of Martha's former colleagues, and a gentle afternoon sun. I looked at those young faces and saw a focus I once saw in Theodore when he held his first business plan. I hoped they would have opportunities, but I also hoped they would understand boundaries. Our life settled into a different kind of stability. No more sudden transfers, no more late-night calls. I slept better. Martha smiled more. We started cooking together again. Simple meals, warm enough. In the evenings, we walked around the nearby park. An old wooden bench became our usual spot. One afternoon, we sat on that bench sharing 2 homemade sandwiches. Nothing fancy, no decoration. I chewed slowly, tasting the bread and fresh vegetables. Martha joked that this meal was better than many expensive restaurants. I laughed, a rare light laugh. I thought about the wet towel that started it all. It no longer came to me with bitterness. It became a marker, the place where I stopped, turned around, and chose a different path, not for revenge, but to preserve my dignity. Theodore later sent a short message. He said he and Josephine were considering moving to a more affordable state, starting over. I replied with one sentence only: do it carefully. Nothing more, nothing less. Some lessons can only be learned when there is no cushion left behind. As evening settled, I looked into the open space ahead and spoke as if to an old friend. Don't let love turn you into a tool. A family without gratitude is just a castle built on sand. I didn't say it to blame anyone. I said it to finish, to end a long chapter where I had confused sacrifice with silence and silence with love. A light breeze passed through the park. Martha leaned her shoulder against mine. No more words were needed. In that moment, I understood something clearly. True wealth isn't in gold-covered meals. It's in the ability to sit down, eat something simple, and know you are exactly where you should be, with the right person, and owing no one anything except kindness. If you've listened this far, this story may have touched something familiar. Family is not a place to perform. It is a place for respect and gratitude. Love does not mean unlimited sacrifice, and silence held for too long can quietly push everything off course. If this story made you think, please tap like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Every follow helps stories like this, slow, honest, and human, continue to be told. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember this: keep your kindness, but never lose your boundaries.